All right, folks, we are back here. It is 6:51 in the PM on Friday, September the 27th, 2024. The future is here. The future is now. That phone number is 219-885-1371. 219-885-1371. That's 219-885-1371. We just talked about Marcellus Williams, and we talked about one of supposed to be Gary's finest, who turned out to not maybe be so fine after all, James Bond, who is accused of some pretty heinous things with an underage child. And it's unfortunate. Well, multiple people now, multiple victims, and it is a really unfortunate thing to have to deal with. But if you've listened to this show at all for the last 4 years, you know that I talk very often about the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Very often. Signed by William Jefferson Clinton. Y'all call him Bill. What that basically did was undo a lot of the limits on media ownership that Franklin Roosevelt helped set with the Telecommunications Act of 1934. See, there used to be limits on how many radio stations, TV stations, newspapers a company or an individual could own in a particular region or just in the country at large. So in 1996, before Bill Clinton undid this, the company that owned the most radio stations owned 40 radio stations coast to coast. 40. By 2002, just 6 years later, Clear Channel, which is now iHeartMedia, ended up owning 1,200 stations coast to coast. And so what we have now is we have an individual named George Soros. If you pay attention to the news, you might hear George Soros. To the Republicans, he's the boogeyman. To a lot of Democrats, he's an ally. But right now, what he is doing is basically planning on taking over the second biggest radio network in America. Billionaire George Soros is trying to get the FCC to fast track his takeover of the second biggest radio network in America. He pumped $400 million into Odyssey in February, a network that reaches 165 million monthly listeners and includes a handful of conservative shows, including Sean Hannity, Dana Loesch, Mark Levin, Glenn Beck, and Eric Erickson. Now, however, to take control, Soros Fund Management needs help from the FCC, as the money funneled into buying the bankrupt network comes from overseas. George Soros is not an American. And so what the FCC is doing is allowing a foreigner to come over and start taking over much of our media right before an important presidential election. I don't care if you're a Democrat. I don't care if you're a Republican. Media ownership being concentrated in so few hands is always a terrible thing. Now, under the existing FCC rules, foreign company ownership of U.S. radio stations is not allowed to exceed 25%. But a filing acquired by the New York Post detailed Soros asking the commission to make an exception. Now, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr is raising the alarm, an alarm that was first set off by Texas Congressman Chip Roy in April. He said the FCC should not create a special Soros shortcut. That's what he told the New York Post. When it comes to a broadcast station acquisition of this size and magnitude, hundreds of radio stations across more than 45 markets, the FCC needs to run its full and normal review process. The FCC should not be skipping steps or waiving required agency processes. Now, Roy had written earlier that the Soros Group would usually petition to get its foreign funding sources vetted by the FCC first, but that they are trying to waive that process and put it off until sometime down the road, indicating that those foreign stakeholders will be given special warrants in the meantime. Odyssey, as I said earlier, is the nation's second biggest radio network after iHeart Network with 220 stations. Sources told the Post Soros' take is about 40% of the company's senior debt, a massive chunk, which, although not a majority, could yield effective control of the media giant when it emerges from bankruptcy. The timing of this deal is just months before the 2024 presidential election, and this has raised many eyebrows. One insider who noted that he is indeed a Republican said he felt it is possible that Soros was buying the stake to exert influence on public opinion leading up to the election. The FCC did not respond to the Post's request for comment. In the past 2 years, Soros Fund Management, a rep for which they do not comment on ongoing transactions, has made moves into American radio. It brokered Univision $60 million sale in 2022 of 18 mostly conservative Hispanic radio stations, including right-wing powerhouse Radio Mambi. The same year, George Soros invested another chunk of cash into the liberal podcast network Crooked Media, which is the home of very popular Pod Save America. If you know anything about political podcasting, Pod Save America is it's probably the biggest one, or right up there. The newly formed network was run by in June 2022, the Soros-backed Latino Media Network bought Mambi, which was a mainstay of Miami's hardline anti-communist Cuban exile community for decades, and 17 other Spanish-language radio stations from Univision in an estimated $60 million deal. This newly formed network was run by two former Democratic operatives, Stephanie Valencia and Jess Morales Roqueto, who worked on Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's political campaigns. Valencia also worked in the Obama White House. Wow. So thanks to the New York Post for that story. I thought it was pretty incredible that much of the mainstream media wasn't covering this. I mean, I guess I probably should not be surprised at this point that the corporate media that is owned and controlled by billionaires like George Soros would not take much time to focus on something that is very consequential and could be a major influence on our election that's coming up. But mostly looking at this deal, it's another reminder to me of how much politics has changed in my lifetime thus far. The Democrats have learned how to do capitalism. When I was a kid in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a lot of talk about how the Republican oil men and all the Wall Street guys and all the sort of big money right-wing Koch brothers and T. Boone Pickens and all these other people were influencing elections and buying up media, and all these Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch, all these people were using their power to influence our elections and to influence our democracy. And now what we've seen over the last decade, well, the last 15 years, is the Democrats have become the party of the rich. As I've reported right here many times, the Democrats now control 90% of the richest congressional districts in America. 90%. 90 out of 100. Silicon Valley, Manhattan, Beverly Hills, the suburbs of Virginia, like the power centers of America are full of liberals. Powerful, rich, and powerful liberals. It used to be the oil money that scared everybody and Wall Street money, and now it's Silicon Valley. And now it's all these big corporate liberals who are buying up our media and influencing elections. Now, George Soros, for a lot of people, is just considered some sort of liberal boogeyman. You know, that's how the conservative, the Republicans see him. But those of us who are involved in either activism or in some political conscious movements, he actually got very much involved in the Black Lives Matter movement back in Ferguson. If you can remember in 2014, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, that's when the whole Black Lives Matter issue came up into the consciousness of most American people. And it was actually George Soros who invested in the corporate wing of Black Lives Matter, the website run by the 3 black lesbians and the gay dude in the vest. I forget what that brother's name is. The original Black Lives Matter protesters, who were young men from that community, they were out there. They did all the work. They did all the fighting. They did all the protesting. And they all suffered greatly for it. A lot of those guys. DeAndre Joshua's body was found inside of a burned car just blocks away from the protests. He was only 20 years old and was shot in the head before his car was torched. Darren Seals, who I've talked about a lot on this show, and he was shown on video comforting Michael Brown's mother after he'd been murdered. He met the same exact fate as DeAndre Joshua. A few years later, he was found shot to death in a car, a burning car, in September of 2016. 4 others of the original Black Lives Matter protest, Mashawn McCarroll, Edward Crawford, Danye Jones, and Bassem Masri, who is a Palestinian American who devoted himself to fighting black liberation. He just was found mysteriously on a bus. They said he died of an overdose of fentanyl, just mysteriously. Though, you know, all these guys who just happened to be a part of the original Ferguson protest. Now, I'm not saying George Soros did that or had anything to do with that. But what I'm saying is that what George Soros did was he took that protest movement from them. He picked the winners of that protest movement. The people who would be the face of that movement would be the 3 women who had Black Lives Matter Inc. and the gay dude in the vest. He actually bankrolled McKesson. I want to say his name was Delray McKesson. He actually bankrolled his run for the mayor of Baltimore and helped him buy a house in Baltimore at one point while he was running for office. So these people become the face of a movement that had nothing to do with them. They weren't even from there. And it is because you have people in the back, billionaires like George Soros, who are picking the winners and losers. And this is how black people's movements end up being hijacked. Very few people know who King D, Darren Seals, is. I talk about him a lot on this show because I believe people need to hear his voice. This brother was very much an important figure, and his voice should have been heard a lot more. We could use a brother like that right now in this country. So that's why I talk about him so much. But he has gone largely forgotten by much of the public because the winners, who are those women and the other dude who weren't even there, they just showed up and got all the attention. They're the ones who ended up on Oprah. They're the ones who ended up on CNN. They're the ones who end up with a hashtag that goes worldwide, and they're the ones who ended up collecting hundreds of millions of dollars. They are the ones who were picked by George Soros, not the original brothers who did all the fighting, who did all the protesting, who did all the work. And that's part of the problem with having a few billionaires who get to own and control our media. They get to pick and choose which Negroes that y'all gonna listen to and that the world's gonna listen to. And so that's why it's important. I believe all of us, we have to stand up against the sort of corporate ownership of our media, the concentration of media. Turn off corporate media. Turn it off. I have to tell you guys this on a weekly basis. There are independent radio stations like the very one you're listening to right now, where we are fortunate to work for somebody like Marion Williams and Tommy Williams. These brothers have allowed me to have a voice and say on this station what I could never say on CNN, on MSNBC, on all these corporate George Soros owned radio stations, on all the iHeartMedia radio stations. They would never allow this. And that is the tragedy of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Independent media is going the way of the dodo. Thank the Lord that we still have stations like WLTH where you can have a voice and say something that is real and not just, read the script of the billionaire class and the military industrial complex and the prison industrial complex and Wall Street, like the puppets on MSNBC, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. All right, folks, that's pretty heavy. So let's have some fun. Let's get into the Happy Happies. We'll be right back after these.